Today, I'd like to walk you through the CockroachDB Cloud API. This is a REST interface that allows programmatic access to CockroachDB Cloud and serverless and dedicated clusters. You can use the API to gain a holistic view of spend and cluster health across all of your clusters together. And we spent a couple of days putting together a demo to demonstrate these features to you. This is a public demo, so you can hit the URL and access it for yourselves. By default, everyone will have read access to it. I'll show you what admin access looks like, but remember, this is just a skin on top of the API. You can build your own UIs using the Cloud API. So what we can see here is the total spend across all of our clusters. This information isn't available through the Cloud Console, so this is information that we've gained from using the Cloud API. We can also see a cost breakdown by cluster, and we can also see the health of all the clusters. Currently, the 6 clusters that we run are all healthy. If any of those clusters were to become unhealthy, this will be reflected in the API and hence in the UI. Scrolling down, we can see a summary of all of the clusters, be they serverless or dedicated, the regions that they're deployed across, the plan, be it serverless or dedicated, and any spend limit that's applied to it. I'll click on one of these now to show you an example of a serverless cluster. And in here, we can see the current spend limit for that cluster, the plan, which is serverless, when we created it, the version of CockroachDB. This will update automatically as the Cockroach Labs team roll out upgrades to your clusters, and the regions that we've deployed across. This is a multi-region serverless cluster, and we can see that there are no nodes associated with this because it's a serverless cluster. When I show you a dedicated cluster, you'll see how many nodes we've got in each of the regions. In this cluster, there are currently 3 databases. With the right permissions, I can add a database and delete a database. And because this is a serverless cluster, there aren't any nodes associated with this. Let's hop over to a dedicated cluster to see what that looks like. This config looks slightly different. Because it's a dedicated cluster, we've configured the nodes that run our cluster. In this case, GCP M1 standard 2s with 15 gigabytes each, 450 IOPS and 2 CPUs. It shows that it's a dedicated plan when it was created, the version of CockroachDB that's running, and on which cloud it's deployed. We've currently got 3 nodes across Europe West 2, West 3, and US West 2, the databases that have been created in that cluster, and the nodes that make the cluster up. Currently, they're all live, but if they weren't, this will be reflected in the UI. I'll now sign in to show you what this looks like from an admin perspective. The information at the top is the same, but now I've got access to create and delete databases. Let's create a database now. There's the database. It's got 0 tables. I can delete it from here. And that's reflected by the Cloud API. Jumping back to a serverless cluster now, I can create databases as I was able to with the dedicated cluster, but I can also set spend limits. Let's assume that $100 is too much for this cluster. I can lower that down to 0, and that's reflected via the config. If we need to up the limit because we've hit caps, we can update it accordingly, and that's reflected immediately. To wrap up, this is a demo that we put together in just a couple of days that sits on top of the Cloud API. This is something that you can harness to surface insights to your own teams and to automate the administration of your clusters.